Namaste, everyone. Please welcome to this seminar of Indic Studies Toronto. Today, the topic is how ancient India seeded a knowledge revolution. So, our speaker today is Sahana Singh ji. She's an author and an engineer, and she has written a book, wonderful book, The Educational Heritage of Ancient India. And she is going to release a second book soon. Her specialty is water management, and her passion is ancient Indian education. So right now we are going to hear from her. Welcome, Sahana ji, and please continue.
Thank you. Namaste. Namaste to everyone. Thank you, Samir ji, for inviting me. So in the next 25-30 minutes, I'll give you an idea about how ancient India seeded a knowledge revolution around the world. It was not just confined to India. So I'm sharing my screen already. And this is the cover of my book, my first book, The Educational Heritage of Ancient India, which was published in 2017. It's available on Amazon, and I'm writing the second book on the same subject, which I'll tell you about a little later. So this book talks about how India was a center of learning for thousands of years before it was destroyed later on. And today what we see is, of course, which is a very pale shadow of what it was before. So the book takes you to the ancient times and then tells you the whole trajectory, gives you the trajectory of the education, how it evolved, how it went through various stages. um, so when India was the educational capital of the world, so we are talking about a time, say about 3000 BC, 5000 BC, and way earlier than that as well. Students came from different parts of the world. They came from Western Asia, China, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Lanka. And they came to study in India because not only were the universities, not only were the centers of education very famous, but also the teachers, the gurus, the acharyas who taught in these institutes were also famous. Their names were known to the students. Some of their books had already been read by these students, and they would there was a mad rush to come and study in India. And many of these students made dangerous journeys. It was not like today when you can just get your passport and take a flight. So they would start off with these journeys saying goodbye to their parents, not sure whether they would go back home, and then they would come in search of their guru, the institute, and to see if they can get admission, because there would be ships. They would make journeys on sea, and you never know when there's going to be a strong wind which will blow, which will cause a wreck. And some of them, of course, trekked across mountains. They came walking across Himalayas. They trekked across deserts. So it was very difficult. Or they would use carts and other modes of transport. And of course, there were robbers, bandits. There would be illnesses which could strike them on the way. So those who embarked on higher education would take years and years to come back home and visit their parents. And there would be a joyous celebration when they returned with what you can call a degree from India. And there were very difficult admission tests in most of the well-known institutes of India, whether you take Nalanda or whether you go to any of even the Gurukulas. There were difficult admission tests. And in the case of Nalanda, there is a mention of coaching centers that were available that were located somewhere around in the villages surrounding Nalanda, where the students could actually get coaching before they went and appeared for the admission tests in Nalanda. So the focus on merit, there was a great focus on merit. Nobody would just get admission because, he's from this category or that category. He has to be good, and he should have the adhikara to, he should understand the subject and to teach later on, because every student was a potential teacher, and so they would be picked very carefully. So the focus on merit led to highly original work in art, logic, grammar, mathematics, engineering, and sciences, especially medicine, chemistry, physics, metallurgy, navigation. And this is just a small sample of subjects that were taught and were sought after, because there are many, many more. I have left out many more. And it was not just in these esoteric subjects, even in vocations, India was a center where people could get trained. There were master sculptors, master painters, various kind of skills which had reached the highest level of excellence in India. So here is a map showing some of the universities and centers of education in India, which I used in my first book. But in my second book, it is going to have many more centers, double or triple of this, which will be shown on the map. So this is the earlier map, and you can see the cluster of centers of universities in the eastern side, as well as in the southern side, and a few in the north. So in the east, you can see Nalanda, Odantapura, Vikramshila, Jagaddala, Somapura. Many of these centers are now in Bangladesh. Then you have Tibet, which is also very important, which was all part of the same ecosystem as India's. Then, so these were all very well-known universities, very famous. In fact, Bihar got its name today, Bihar, because there were so many viharas, so many the centers of of learning, the monasteries which were called viharas. Then in the north, you have Takshashila, which is actually the oldest excavated university. They say it is the 6th century, 7th century BC, but it's most likely much older than even 3000, 4000 BC. Very old. So Takshashila today falls in Pakistan. Then there was Sharda Peeth in Kashmir, a very well-known temple university, Purushapura. And if you go to the west, you have Vallabhi, which was a very, very important center of the disciplines related to administration, governance, all those economics. All these were very well taught in Vallabhi. And then when you go to the south, of course, you see a whole variety of educational institutes, temple universities, mathas, ghatikas. So they were the educational institutes were tailored to to different kinds of students. Not everybody would want to go to the highest level. Some would just want a basic. So all those different kinds of institutes were there. Kanchipuram and all the. I'm not naming them all. So if you buy my book, you can see them. Just one thing I want to mention is that there was a lot of mobility. So we think that these centers of education just had students who lived close by. Not so. Many students made long journeys. Even within India, they would travel from south, north, east. So you had professors who came from different parts of India, and you had students who came from different parts of India, and you had professors who, after teaching a number of years in one university, would go and set up another university. So that's the way Vallabhi was set up. Vallabhi University was set up by professors who were earlier in Nalanda. So that's the way it worked. A lot of mobility among the students and professors. They were determined to get admission in the institute of their choice. So it's not just in recent times that you have students preparing for IIT and then going and joining, traveling to the IIT that they got admission in. It was happening even in ancient times. Here is a picture of Takshashila, the excavated ruins, which are now in Pakistan. So this is how it looks like. It was all destroyed by the Hunas. Then these are the ruins of Nalanda University, which were destroyed by Bakhtiyar Khilji in the 11th century. So this was a magnificent university. It was a very, very large university. What has been dug up is just 1/10 of the area. So miles and miles all around, and it had a very impressive gate that you entered in, and then you would see a big statue of Buddha at the entrance of the main hall, and there were several such halls, and then there were beautiful ponds with lotuses in them, and there were lots of shade-giving trees, and then there were carvings all around the university, and then because it was a multi-story building, the top stories were covered by mist, and the beauty of this has been described by many Chinese scholars who came to study in Nalanda. How the upper stories would be covered by mist, and it all looked like a beautiful dreamland. The library was extremely well stocked. There were manuscripts that students could go and refer to and copy from. So the library was also very famous. These are the remains of the Telhara University. So you see, we are still digging up universities. We still don't know all of the centers of learning in India. There are many more. So this Telhara, which is mentioned by Zhuangzang, was only excavated in 2009, and it's still going on. And it seems to be even bigger than Nalanda. It is exactly on the lines of Nalanda. And this also would have been probably attracting a lot of students since there has been so much investment into it. I have put this artistic representation of a forest university because you see, we had a different kinds of universities. So the earliest ones were these kind of centers of learning where a guru would be teaching students under a tree. But then this would be like one department, and there would be several departments. There would be different gurus who are teaching in different locations close by. And so a student who has learned from one guru and gained expertise in one subject could go and learn from the other guru. So there were those advanced professors, there were those a little less advanced professors. So in this manner, there were also forest universities which were being managed by sometimes by a central authority. And you see this mentioned in Mahabharata a couple of times and various other texts as well. Then we must know that learning was a sacred duty. Now, why I'm telling you all these things is that the knowledge revolution that started from India happened because we had all these things in place. We had all these institutions. We where where knowledge was valued, where there were ceremonies centered on different stages of learning, and that's how we were able to generate so much of knowledge, which that it caused a revolution and spread to different parts of the world. So when a child was born, the day the child would learn how to read and write, that was a very memorable day. It was to be celebrated, and the ceremony was called Vidyarambha, which is still exists in southern India, where the child is tracing letters, the alphabets on rice. And in Bengal, it's called Hate Khori, which is done in a different way, which is again they do it on a slate. They write Om. The first letter they write is Om, and that's done during Saraswati Puja. Then there was another ceremony which is similar to today, what we call graduation. And after so many years of study, 8 to 10, 12, 13, whatever, some students even took far more than that because they wanted to go deeper into the subjects. So there would be a ceremony called Samavartana. It was a beautiful ceremony where they would be chanting, which you will find today also in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Some of the shlokas from there used to be invoked, and the student would be blessed to be and he would be asked to be responsible with whatever he had learned and share it with the right people, and also not make it into a business, so that education does not turn into a business where the teachers are trying to become rich. So all these things were uh, told during the Samavartana ceremony. So these are just some snippets I have put to show that the foundation of modern scientific thought is actually in the Shastras, because there are so many logical scientific statements which are there in our scriptures, if you call them that. So in the Nyaya Shastra, you will find a sutra by Akshapada Gautama where he says, truth exists whether or not we humans acknowledge it. See what level of logic they had attained. Then there is this statement in Sushruta Samhita where it says, a physician who has learned one science only cannot be sure of his own science. He was saying this in the case of Ayurveda. And for this reason, the physician has to be versed in many sciences. So again, it's a very logical way of putting it and a very interdisciplinary approach to learning, that you cannot just focus on your own subject. You've also got to know what the other subjects, what is the knowledge in other disciplines, so that you enrich your own discipline. So it was a society which supported learning, and this is very important to highlight because that is exactly why we had a knowledge revolution. Because the ecosystem was such that everybody wants to learn, the good students want to become good teachers. So that was the ecosystem, and the teacher was the most respected person in society. Uh, and the entire society supported scholars financially, emotionally, personally. So during religious ceremonies, donations were given to teachers and educational institutions. There was great merit associated with donating to teachers. So they would actually say, wow, I have given so much money to set up this Gurukula, or to help this Gurukula, to help this teacher, or for spreading this subject. So that was the kind of society. And education could be funded as an act of commemoration of departed relatives. So, for example, if a son got killed in a war, then the father would set up a scholarship in his name, or chairs would be set up in universities. So we think these are modern phenomena, but when you start reading the history of India, you will know that this is ancient. This is a very ancient Indian custom. And so the kings would also gift lands to gurus. So if a guru became well known and he's admired for his teaching methods, then the kings would come to know, and they would gift lands to these gurus so that they can build centers of education and accommodate more students, arrange for food for them, and all that. So there are many inscriptions which talk about how kings are funding the gurus and the educational institutions. So the ecosystem was such that the seekers of knowledge were freed from the burden of earning a livelihood, because that is the biggest burden. If you know, if you are not supported financially, then you will not be able to devote time to research. That's why we have all these grants, research grants. But that was the ecosystem even at that time. That it was way better than what it is today. That the seekers of knowledge could totally focus on their education. They did not have to worry about food. So if they knocked at the door of any house, they would get food. They would instantly get food. And then universities also would be funded by the villages around them, and all the rice and the grain and the milk and the curds, all these things used to be sent to them by the houses, the households which were around the universities or the temple universities. So I think I've already mentioned the ethos of the times demanded that Brahmin scholars led simple lives and engaged in pursuit of knowledge without amassing riches. It fell upon the shoulders of wealthy non-Brahmin families and farmers to support those who devoted their entire lives to learning and teaching. So people understood the sacrifice that the teachers were making in order to teach, right? So they would forego a life of luxury and pleasure so that they could learn and teach. So this was respected. So there was no Brahminism that you see today. It wasn't there in those times. The expenses were subsidized by the ruling kings. Nalanda was funded by the revenues of 100 villages. The students and teachers received clothes, food, bedding, and medicines free of cost. And in some ashramas, there is a mention of rich students who are paying fees, while the Brahmin students who were too poor to pay would do menial tasks. So they would bring water, they would bring firewood. That work they would do in lieu of paying fees. And if they wanted, they could also get financial assistance from households. Of course, during Dakshina, there was a time at the end of the educational period, they had to give a Dakshina to the Guru. And if the Brahmin students could not afford it, they could go and ask for help, financial help. Now, this is a slide that in which I want to show you the culture of debate that existed in India. Debate was extremely important, where two different schools of thought of the leaders of both those schools would sit and debate, and there'll be a free exchange of ideas. But of course, it would be a structured one, and that is exactly why the body of knowledge grew in India. So we had an ecosystem where the students were funded well and taken care of, and then this ecosystem of speech and debate, which helped to expand knowledge. And in this picture, you can see the famous debate between Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra, where the judge is a lady. It's being adjudicated by by a lady who was a scholar herself, which goes to show that women also were highly educated. And the terminology of debate was well developed. So I've just given a sample of terms. If you read my book, all the various other terms are mentioned. The sadhya, which was the thesis to be established, siddhanta, the proposition, hetu, reason, udaharana, which was examples given during the debate, pratyaksha, perception, anumana, inference, pramana, proof. So all these terms used to be used during debate. So it was so well structured. You could not just jump into a debate and just go on a tangent and talk anything. There were rules on how debaters could be disqualified if they resorted to evasion and various other things which are mentioned in the Shastras. So debate was an intrinsic part of education. The centers of learning played a big role in nourishing the spirit of open debate. The kings were fond of organizing intellectual tournaments, and this was looked forward to by the citizens. So, whenever a big debate would be organized, people would go in droves to see what the scholars were talking, and that's how they would enhance their own knowledge. And the scholars who were able to put forward finer points in philosophy, those who were ornate in diction, they were rewarded. So in this manner, communication skills were constantly honed. A scholar could not be great if he could not communicate properly. That was so important. It was not like today. Today it is, you see scholars who sometimes are struggling for words or they are not fluent. That was not the case in those times. Now, temples were also centers of learning, though they were centers of worship and everything else that go with temples, right? Where, social ceremonies and all used to be held, but they were also centers of learning. So typically, a well-known temple would have an annex where the discourses would be held and debates would be held. And also there would be colonies of teachers living around the temple, and I'll come to that later. Uh, these are the some of the temple universities like Sharda Peeth in Kashmir, which is only this thing is left of it after it was destroyed by Muslims in Kashmir. When there was a whole campaign to destroy the centers of Hindu learning, that was when the Sharda Peeth was destroyed. But it was a magnificent temple university. That the goddess has been described by Shankaracharya. Sharda is, of course, Saraswati, as you know. And so there was not only a beautiful temple and a university, but also a library with amazing manuscripts, books, which were referred to by scholars from different parts of India. So even from southern India, Ramanujacharya went all the way to refer to manuscripts before he wrote his own magnum opus. So he went to Sharda Peeth. Now, Agrahara is one of the institutions that even today we find them in ruins in southern India. We don't know if they existed in northern India because northern India was all the centers of learning were destroyed. So Agrahara these were colonies of teachers' houses very close to temples, and in these the teachers would teach in their houses. So even if there was if there was no discourse in the temple, they were actually teaching in their own houses, small groups of students, and they were all living next to each other. So sometimes they would very spontaneous debates would erupt right there on the streets. Because there are scholars teaching different subjects, teaching in their own houses. So students who are interacting with each other while walking across would have debates, and then the people living there could all listen to it. So that was the atmosphere. The agraharas were also like centers of education themselves. Then mathas also were centers of learning, but they were much more than that. They were multi-purpose institutions. So the acharyas and the students lived together in these mathas, just like gurukulas, and they also served as rest houses for travelers, including pilgrims and musicians. So imagine this is an educational institution, and there are classes going on. Students are learning from their teachers. They live there. They have their boarding, but then there are also rooms for travelers to come and stay. So they could be pilgrims, they could be musicians, they could be artists, and anyone who walked in was served food in these mathas. Okay. And so they were all, because they were well funded by rich people and all that. So, food would be given to whoever came in. And some mathas had hospitals to take care of the sick. Then so inscriptions indicate that some mathas had vets, veterinarian doctors who would take care of sick animals. So you could take sick animals there and look for the vet who would treat the animals. Then many mathas had libraries and they preserved manuscripts because of obviously they were educational institutions. And these mathas were funded by kings or communities or philanthropists. So many of the mathas were very famous, like Vyasa Tirtha's mathas in Karnataka. They were very well known because a very well-rounded education was given to students who studied there. And Vyasa Tirtha himself, the sage, when he gave his lectures, they were very popular. And there are many examples of mathas like that. So there was an interdisciplinary approach to knowledge. There was no artificial divide between religion, science, and other subjects. So, for example, the Brahmin priests themselves needed to be well versed in mathematics, and the altars which were used for the fire ceremonies, the homas, the yagyas, had to be in accurate geometrical shapes. So they needed to know geometry, solid geometry. The yantras which were drawn at the time of Homa also needed geometry. Then, for the auspicious timing at which rituals needed to be performed, they needed knowledge of astronomy and trigonometry. So there was no hard barrier between religion and sciences. So we didn't have a case like Galileo, who was arrested after an inquisition by the Catholic Church because he said the earth went around the sun. In India, the priests themselves were astronomers, even in the Vedic period, ancient times. And similarly, maths and poetry were not separated. You have Bhaskara II, who was a poet mathematician who wrote his formulae, who wrote his various theories in mathematics. He wrote them in a verse form, okay, in shlokas. Now I come to how India's knowledge was spread. So I told you about the ecosystem and now how that helped to build up the knowledge of other countries around them. So China was number one because China was very proactive in getting the knowledge out of India. Thousands of Sanskrit manuscripts were carried to China, not just Buddhist texts, but science and maths. So Kashyapa Matanga and Dharmaratna were the first two scholars that we can find evidence of. There might have been earlier ones. They were the first two to travel to China. And they endured severe hardship. They almost died in the process of reaching China because they had to walk across Gobi Desert and all that. I mean, Kashyapa had to do that. Dharmaratna took a different route. But after they went and settled in China, then that opened the floodgates for many, many Indian scholars to travel from India to China, settle down there, and carry manuscripts with them and translate them to Chinese. So all these names like Sanghavarma, Dharmasatya, Dharmakala, these are some of the names of scholars. There are many, many more who migrated from India to China. Uh, so Kashmir supplied a steady stream of erudite scholars to China. Then there is mention of a scholar from southern India called Dharmaruchi, who traveled from southern India to China for 20 and he lived there for 20 years from 693 to 713 Common Era, and he translated 53 works into Chinese. Just see the degree of dedication and collaboration that would have been needed for this. Then there was competition for scholars from India. For example, Dharmakshema, a scholar from India, was shot by an assassin because two kings were vying for his services, and then one of them decided to get him assassinated because he said, if I cannot get him in my court, then the other king also should not get him. Uh, and then there was a well-known scholar called Amoga Vajra who collected 500 texts from different parts of India and went to China. Of course, he didn't translate all of them himself. The work was carried forward. The Indian astronomers and mathematicians from the best universities of India held high positions in China's scientific establishments. This was because the Chinese emperor used to woo the best scholars. There were a lot of incentives given to them to come and settle in China. Temples would be built for them. They would be given a lot of incentives. So the Indian scientist Gautama Siddha, who is called Kutan Siddha in Chinese, he became president of China's official board of astronomy in the 8th century, and he translated Navagraha calendar into Chinese. So their calendar was deeply influenced by our calendar. And Indian numerals were introduced to China because of the way our scholars were going to China. Even the printing press, which was developed in China, was due to the Buddhist scholars who went from India. And printing was used as a means to spread Buddhist thought. Now, the Buddhist monks who went and lived in China, most of them were trained in Ayurveda because it was a part of healing. So that's how the medical knowledge got transferred to China. And ophthalmology, especially, was very popular. The monks who could perform cataract surgery, the Indian monks who went to China, they were extremely popular. And the texts in which there was knowledge of ophthalmology was translated with great reverence, and various other medical subjects like pediatrics and gynecology. All these texts were translated and practiced also because of the Indian scholars. Now, the Chinese scholars who came to India, they regarded the collecting of texts from India as a holy duty, and it was also like a competitive activity. The different Chinese scholars who came to study in India were competing with each other to carry the maximum number of texts and manuscripts back to China. So, I Ching speaks of having collected 400 different texts and 500,000 shlokas. But this is lesser than, he could not beat the record of Zhuangzang, who took 657 texts from India. So there was a monastery in Zhejiang province which became famous for the treatment of gynecological problems because a monk from India presented a medical treatise on gynecology to the monastery. And so using that treatise, handbooks on medicines were printed, and women used to go there and get treated. And that's how then many other monasteries were also became centers of medicine, of medical treatment. So the practice of medicines in monasteries became quite common because of this influx of Indian monks. Here is a picture of Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva was one of the star scholars from India who lived in China for a long time. He was also the teacher of Fahiya, and because of him, Fahiya came to study in India. So he translated more than 100 Sanskrit works which became masterpieces of Chinese literature. So the biggest problem was how to translate Sanskrit to Chinese, because Chinese being a limited language and a phonetic language and a pictorial, with a pictorial script, semi-pictorial script. So it was very difficult to translate. And so the Chinese students were always looking for better and better translations of Sanskrit texts. And that's why they used to keep coming to India, because so see, after Fahiya came the others like Yuanzhang. Yuanzhang was not happy with the earlier translations, so he wanted better translations and he came. So anyway, going back to Kumarajiva, there was a battle for his services again between the king of Kaucha and the Chinese emperor. And Kumarajiva was kept in prison for some time. All these things happened. There was a lot of politics also around getting Indian scholars to live and teach and translate in China. So that was about China. I'm not going to tell you about how Indian knowledge was transferred to Japan and Southeast Asia, but this is all mentioned in my second book, which is my upcoming book. So now I come to how knowledge was transferred from India to Greece. So the earliest contact was Pythagoras, that we have evidence of, Pythagoras. He was noted by many scholars such as Apuleius, Eusebius, Apollonius, Philostratus. All these scholars have mentioned that Pythagoras got his education in India. And his vegetarianism, because Pythagoras became a staunch vegetarian after he visited India, and also espoused the Vedantic thought, like, there is even animals have an Atman, animals have a soul, and so we should not be killing animals. So a lot of, and of rebirth, transmigration of the souls, all these things which came from the Vedas were due to Pythagoras, because Pythagoras took them to the Greeks. Now, that is, Pythagoras was one point of contact through which Indian knowledge went to Greece, one of the earliest. Then after that, of course, Plato and others, they took Pythagorean thought forward. They were all deeply influenced. And that's how ultimately Alexander invaded India. He was looking for India because it was known as a country which produced the greatest knowledge. Now, Rishi Kanada from the 6th century BCE has influenced Democritus greatly. Democritus, the Greek scholar, who is considered the father of modern science and logical thinking and everything, but he has borrowed extensively from Kanada. And Democritus had a student called Hippocrates, who is considered the father of Western medicine. So you can see all these connections, how Indian knowledge went to the West, went to the Greeks first. And Democritus is also known to have traveled widely in search of knowledge, and some people say that he also came to India. And that's how he got that knowledge of Kannada, the text. If he has not traveled to India, at least he has got hold of the texts that were the Vaisheshika Sutra of Kannada. And then come to the medical knowledge, which is the Materia Medica, which was compiled by Greek physician Dioscorides during 50 to 70 Common Era. It is found to contain a large number of herbs which were grown in India. They were not grown in Greece. So that shows how the medical knowledge and the knowledge of plants and the diseases that they cured all this knowledge was taken from India. There was also the Library of Alexandria, which was a big center of dissemination of knowledge from India. And this in Alexandria was known to search all the ships coming and docking there to see if they were carrying any manuscripts. And those manuscripts were all taken. They were copied, and the original would be kept in the library, and the copy would be given back to the ship. So this was a very common practice in Alexandria, and that's how they got a lot of knowledge, a lot of texts from India which were kept in the library. And of course, the commentaries on the Indian texts and the translations of these texts in different languages, in Persian and all, were kept there in Alexandria. Uh, so the first acquaintance of Arabs with scientific astronomy and Hindu numerals was through the works of Brahmagupta of 7th century CE. So when Brahmagupta's works like Brahmasputa Siddhanta, all these works made an entry, the Arabs came in contact with those works and translated them. Then there was like a revolution, a knowledge revolution, right? Uh, and so the Indian scholars were often invited to Baghdad. Uh, and so there was a house of wisdom in Baghdad, just like the Alexandria Library earlier. And so from 8th to 13th century, a lot of texts, Indian texts, which were translated to various languages, were kept there. So texts on mathematics, science, and various subjects were all kept there. So that's how the knowledge of India was being preserved and being translated and built upon, right? It was a foundation. Then Indian physician Manka in Hindi, was in the court of the fifth Abbasid Khalifa, and he translated Sushruta Samhita into Persian. And it was a very important text. All these were classic texts which were highly revered by the people who translated and later built upon that knowledge, right? So the Muslim intellectuals such as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Farghani, Al-Tabari, Al-Khwarizmi, they played a very important role in transferring the Indian knowledge of maths, science, astronomy, philosophy, and even music to the Islamic world. So they made very good translations. They didn't do blind translations. They would actually understand it and write it in their own words, but they would also give credit to the Indian scholars. So maths was called Hindisa, which meant this, it was pertaining to India. Maths was always seen as an Indian subject. Now, the European Renaissance was propelled by the works of Arabic scholars, which were passed off as original works by Europeans. So, the works written by the Arabs were translated into Latin, and credit was not given to the Arab scholars many times. And that's how the Renaissance, which took place. Actually, so many books being published one after the other. It happened because so many books were translated. So many Indian books were translated, of course, not directly from Indian scripts, but from Arabic. There was a translation movement, the Toledo School of Translators, in Toledo in Spain in the 12th and 13th century. So many Arabic works were translated to Latin, and that's how maths and science knowledge from India was transmitted to Europe. The knowledge transfers continued with greater intensity during colonial period from 14th century, when the Portuguese came looking for India. So that time, then they did not need Arab middlemen anymore. They didn't need any Arabic scholars. So the contents of hundreds or maybe even thousands of Indian books made their way into the books in Europe. So the books that they would get hold of, they would just copy them, plagiarize from them, write monographs, sometimes give credit, but mostly not. And then they would be featured in the European journals. It was as if a flood of Indic thought had been unleashed into Europe. So Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British all collected large numbers of manuscripts. So even today, if you go to their countries, you go to their libraries, you will find those original manuscripts that they got and which they translated. So there is Bibliotheca Malabarica, which is a classic example. It's a catalog of over 100 Tamil manuscripts collected by one single missionary, Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, during the 18th century. And here is a statue of Garcia de Orta. He's highly revered because he translated so many books, so many medical texts into Portuguese. And he lived in Goa for a long time. And he kept collecting, he started growing those plants himself where he lived in his house. He kept talking to the Siddha practitioners in Tamil Nadu. He talked to the Ayurveda practitioners, learned what plants they were using in their preparations, and then he started growing them. He started experimenting with them, and then he started publishing them like his own original works in the monographs in journals in Portuguese. So he wrote this famous book, which influenced later works on medicine. So that's how you see the Indian medical knowledge went to the West. Now, how all this edifice of learning, it all collapsed because of enslavement and colonialism. The onslaught of Islamic invaders, followed by European colonialism, led to a massive destruction of Indian systems of education. So there was some revival now and then, but even 75 years after independence, I can say there has not been much of a decolonization. So the first deathly blow to learning came from the Muslims. Of course, earlier there were the Hunas who had destroyed the Takshashila, but the systematic destruction that took place was under the Islamic invaders. So all these famous universities, Nalanda, Vikramshila, Udantapuri, Jagaddala, Somapura, Vallabhi, they were all destroyed by the Islamic the practitioners. Okay, and that's how, when you destroy, imagine destroying a huge university. Like, today, can you think of destroying burning the library, killing all the scholars? What a massive destruction it would be, right? And we don't even have those manuscripts anymore, which were in Nalanda. And it's only because some of them managed to escape to Tibet from Vikramshila when it was destroyed. And that's how in Tibet we get an account of how the destruction happened and what was in those text that was destroyed. So there was destruction of temples and viharas by the Islamic despots. Jizya was imposed, humiliating conditions were imposed on Hindus. Then there was an emphasis on Islamic education. Delhi became a big center of Islamic learning. And the earlier state support, which was there for Hindu for the temples of learning, that was totally withdrawn. And so the only reason why we have those texts available today is because rich businessmen, Hindu rajas, and local communities, Hindu communities, kept the flame of learning alight. So what happened is that Arabic and Persian got imposed during the Muslim rule. There was some respite during Akbar's rule, but and so madrasas were opened up for Hindu children during the rule of Akbar. But again, Aurangzeb came and reversed all of it. Again, the destruction, again the destroying temples and the works that they were producing. And after the Muslim period came the British imperialism, which was actually worse because they destroyed the language itself, and they made people mentally colonized, mentally enslaved. That happened during the British imperialism. And of course, the famous Macaulay's Minute, in which there was a whole education policy that was based on this dictum that we need to create a class of people who are Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals and intellect, right? And how we need to develop this class of people who will worship the English intellectuals and not care so much about the Hindu traditions or Hindu works. So that is how the earlier edifice of knowledge began to collapse. And then once the British rule progressed, right, then all the taxation that was imposed, heavy taxation, in which the people had to just part with everything that they produced. Farmers had almost nothing left for them, and poverty and famines became rampant. And that's how the whole schooling system was destroyed in India. So in this presentation, I've not talked about Dharampal, but in my book, you will find reference to the work of Dharampal, in which he talks about how the Indian schools, when the British came to rule over India, they were actually in the state of decay, but they were still teaching. There were still teachers who were teaching students, and so the students were well versed with alphabets and literacy was high. But how all that was destroyed as the British rule progressed. So I come to the end of my talk, and I just want to, I hope I've made the point that the contribution of India to the global body of knowledge is unparalleled. We created top class institutions, we produced top notch scholars, master artisans, because I did not dwell much on the vocational training, but there were master artisans also who were giving training, and the whole ecosystem of learning which existed helped this body of knowledge to be generated. And the works of some sciences, medicine, maths, music, art, philosophy, various disciplines, All these works were created in the golden period, and this flowed out from India through migration of scholars and major translation movements. So we saw how the works from India were translated to Persian, to Greek, to Arabic, and then how they were translated to Chinese, and then eventually to Latin. So there were major translation movements which helped in transferring India's knowledge. And India provided the base on which the edifice of modern knowledge stands today. So when you go back and look at every discipline that is taught in universities today, most of the disciplines, you go back and see where it all started from, you will find that the trail leads to India. So this is the major point that I want to make. So please look for my second book, I thought it would be published in June, but it looks like it's going to be delayed probably even to July or August. But please look out for it. Tentatively titled "Revisiting the Educational Heritage of India," and it will be available in Hindi and English initially. But I'm also working with translators in Kannada and Gujarati. Hopefully, other languages will follow. And in the new book, I'll talk about some new topics like memory training in ancient India, educational games, why brahmacharya was important, and more on how knowledge was transmitted out of India. There'll also be a chapter on what can today's India learn from her ancient systems of education. So I thank you for listening to me attentively. And here is my email if you want to get in touch with me. You'll find my first book on Amazon, and you can also interact with me on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you very much.
So the first question is, what was the original language in which education was taught in India?
Okay, so the knowledge of higher education was typically Sanskrit. So higher, when you go and learn the Vedas, you go and learn the Upanishad, that would be in English. But the lower education would, by lower, I don't mean lower as in, in a kind of a hierarchy in that sense, but, the more universal education, that would be in the various languages. So all the languages, different parts of different provinces of India had their own languages. So if you went in southern India, then it would be taught in Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam. Went to the north, you would find various dialects in which it would, the basic education would be carried out. And then, of course, there would also be even higher education could also be in the regional languages. But typically, when you went for Vedic education, that would be in Sanskrit.
The next question is, what is Indian government doing to bring back the pre-Macaulay education?
Well, I do see in the new education policy a lot of mention that we need to revive, ancient methods of education, but I don't see too much of detail on how they are going to do that. But I see that Sanskrit is going to be revived. That's been mentioned. But I still want to push the government harder. I want to see the Ved Pachalas, Gurukulas being funded so that, we have a proper chanting of the Vedas and the meanings of the Vedas explained. Not all of this cannot really be done in the university atmosphere that we have today. So we must revive the Ved Pathshalas. And also we need to borrow certain the pedagogical tools from ancient India. So I've dwelt on some of that in my book, right? Like the memory techniques that could be revived, because today we are relying too much on the internet and the hard disk and this and that. We don't really, and the cloud, we don't try to remember things. But in ancient India, there was a lot of stress on remembering things, not just rote learning. I mean, rote learning has got a lot of bad publicity, but we should not throw away the memory training that was given to students in ancient times, because you could not pass an admission test if you didn't have good memory and remember, what various scholars said on different subjects. You have to bring all that knowledge together and then give your own thoughts. So memory was very important. So those are some of the things that we need to bring back by collaborating with the Vedic scholars. And of course, the various, what we need to do when we revive our traditional education is to see how we can make a use of that in modern times, right? So for example, in environmental protection, there are a lot of ideas in our texts, even in mathematics, because if you see Manjul Bhargava, who got the Fields Medal, the highest award in mathematics, which was a few years ago, and he says he spent a lot of time reading the ancient mathematical texts, which gave him the a creative idea to solve problems. So these are the kind of things that we need to do. Mine our ancient texts and see how we can use that today for solving today's problems.
We as NRIs can also sponsor some Ved Pathshalas. That will be a
Which is being done by some, but it's not being done in a systematic way. And I hope that when I travel to India later this year, that's one of my plans. I want to visit Ved Pathshalas and see what they are doing, what do they need, and bring that to light. And maybe then see that funding goes to the right Pathshalas.
There's one question which says, did the students learn at their own pace and were they able to grasp the intricacies of the subject, or did they have to go to a common curriculum like it is today?
Well, from whatever I have seen, I can see that students are learning at their pace. Definitely, it was flexible. There were examinations, of course, but it was flexible. So some students were took very long. I mean, those who studied for more than 10 years, such students were there. Those who finished in 4 or 5 years are also there. So they did learn at their own pace of learning. And also if you go strictly by what is mentioned in the various shastras, they would not proceed to the next level until they have understood what is being taught at the lower level. The gurus would not give them the adhikara to study the higher texts unless they were able to explain what they have learned in the earlier phases of education. So it was a wonderful system of it. If you read and learn more about what it was like, you'll get a sense of loss that today we are not doing it that way. We're just going through we just get our degrees, we do things, we are called so PhDs and all, but we don't have that holistic learning that those scholars had.
That's true. Tapasji, please ask your question.
Okay. Namaste, Shahanaji. The question I wanted to ask was, my experience is this ignorance about India's knowledge is so deep-rooted. Like sometime back, we had traveled to the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and in the central hall where all the senators meet, the wall is filled with, how knowledge has been acquired over years. And not even a mention of India is there. And not only that, they are saying things like zero and all have come from Arab world. They have mentioned China. So they have mentioned every country except India. So what I'm saying, it's one thing, common man not knowing about this knowledge, but it has gone so deep rooted, this ignorance, that how do we correct that? Because it will need a lot of effort. So can you just say something about it, and how should we move forward?
I totally agree with you. So that's exactly why I started writing. I am an engineer by training. And then, of course, I was writing about water management when I got into writing. But how I got into history was exactly for this reason. There is so much of knowledge that India has shared, which the world does not know. That's because we were unfortunate that in India itself, the education policy and the kind of people who were appointed, the education ministers, during this whole period of Congress rule, it was dominated by the leftist narrative. So, the leftist narrative is such that there's no pride in our past. The price is that the past has been erased. It has started from India. So, if we cannot really blame Capitol Hill, because in India itself, it has been a policy where we have been ashamed. We have been so well colonized. Macaulay has been so successful that maybe Macaulay deserves an award for what he has done, how successfully he mentioned how it should be, and then that was exactly what was done. So that is the level of colonization. So it has to start from India. We have to look at ourselves with our own insiders' perspective, produce high quality material, right? If you look at the textbooks that are being used in India, then that is so pathetic that, you can't, unless you start from there, you can't blame the scholars in the West. Of course, the scholars in the West are doing what they have always been doing. Uh, I would so see what I have done personally is, of course, to write this book, and I'm trying to write in simple language, because earlier historians, there have been great historians also in the writing the correct history, but they are not as well, uh, they're not accessed as much because maybe they are not written in a user friendly language. So I'm trying to write in a language which is easily understood. I'm not the only one. There are many others. There is actually a kind of Indic revival. I know in my circles there are many who are writing, but these are still not mainstream. They have to become mainstream in India. They have to be taught in India first of all. Indians in schools and colleges should not be learning the biased history. And then after that, they should be writing papers for the international journals. So there are a lot of challenges. So we have to step up. We have to contribute. We have to give ideas to the Indian government, and of course here also whatever we are doing. For example, I've just started a workshop. Rather, it is Samskara Foundation, which with the help of which I'm going to be teaching high schoolers uh, about our Indian history. But again, they are going to face a problem when they go to college, because they in the college, if they they'll be forced to read in history the books written by the European scholars who have looked at it from the colonialist perspective. Uh, so, I mean, we all have to work together to raise awareness, to get good books written, which are written in scholarly language. And then we have to have to reach out to the scholars in Europe and in America, and somehow do a better job of explaining to them that the narrative which is current is biased. So that is the thing. We need to be leaders in every field. Politically also, we need to go higher up. There are not many Indians who are talking in the leadership positions who are actually talking from the Indic perspective, right? So we have to uh, increase that awareness. So I don't know. I mean, we are, of course, I'm part of Indian history awareness and research, and we are trying to build those bridges, but it has to be scaled up. It has to be very well strategized. Strategy is missing right now. So we need to strategize. We need to talk to parents, because the parents themselves, Hindu parents at home, are not really talking to their children. So the children don't, they just see some rituals being performed. They don't understand why they are performed. And so they become self-loathing Hindus. That itself is happening in the US. In the US, in the circle that I'm moving in, I see that happening. So you see, there are a whole lot of initiatives that need to be launched. I'm sorry, I've not been very comprehensive in my answer, but this is something we all need to talk about and strategize together.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Somebody has asked a question that how did the class system came in being and did it contribute to the decline in education and self-preservation?
The class system.
Yeah, the class system.
Okay. So the caste, it's a very a topic that has not been understood at all. The way it has been projected is like there was a watertight caste system, and that led to the downfall. This is I tell you, this is one of the successes of Macaulay and his people. So it's a big conspiracy theory that refuses to die, that there was a well organized caste system through which the Brahmins usurped absolute power and they excluded other castes. That did not happen, didn't happen that way. It was actually quite mobile. People were moving across different varnas and jatis. Okay, this is a colonial Christian narrative. There was a loose system of varna and jati. So if you see the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavad Purana, Upanishad, they all talk about how birth alone cannot determine one's varna. So a child born into a Brahmin family by Janma, he can be called only a nominal Brahmana, and he has the potential to be a real Brahmana only if he develops the samskara and the swabhava, the swadharma, all that was important. So even Buddha himself, he did not ask for abolishing the varna system. Instead, he said, whatever has been mentioned in the earlier text, that action determined a Brahmana, not birth. So that was the thinking in our civilization. So there were no restrictions on wealth for the so-called lower castes. So there were plenty of wealthy Shudras. In fact, Brahmanas were the ones who were poor mostly, and those Brahmanas who did become rich, they were looked down upon. And the Shudras also established schools, for example, and Shudras were studying. If you see the research done by Dharampal, there were plenty of schools and all in which the so-called lower caste was studying. Okay, and at the elementary or the primary level, education was freely available to everyone, going by the surveys that were carried out by the British themselves in the 18th century, which Dharampal has talked about. And there was a separate educational system for industrial and vocational training. Okay, the artisans, the doctors, and engineers, they got their education via apprenticeships, and there were no caste restrictions in this system. Okay, only when it came to studying the advanced philosophies, there were more Brahmins and Kshatriyas, because meritocracy was so strong. So they were the entry level for higher education uh, was quite controlled. And only a small proportion of the population was engaged in pursuing the higher knowledge of Vedas. Not everybody wanted. So the way it has been projected is a whole lot of people wanted to study the Vedas and they were excluded from that system. And that's not what it was. In fact, most people did not want to study the Vedas. They just wanted to learn a skill or a trade so that they could become rich and they could support their families. So that is how we became the richest country in the world. How do you think all those that money, all the gold came into India? How did all those, the Europeans, why were they complaining that, everything that we buy is coming from India and we are losing all our gold to India? This is actually said by the Romans, that's because we had such a prosperous society where more people were interested in developing skills through the skills were also developed in a Gurukula kind of system, but they were different from the Vedic Pathshalas, the Vedic system, which was more strong and which actually involved a lot of sacrifice. So only a few people who were ready to make that sacrifice, they were the true Brahmanas who would wake up early in the morning, have bath 4 times a day, do this, do that, feed the birds, feed the animals before they had their own meals. All these things had to be followed by those who were ready to walk on the path of a Brahmana. Okay, so it is not like the caste system destroyed India or anything like that. But what destroyed was the narrative that was created, a whole colonialist missionary narrative that made Indians hate themselves and become slavish. That is what destroyed India's educational system.
Sangeeta ji, please go ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for all the information that you shared with us. I just wanted to ask you one question. I come from India and I come from a state which is dominated by the leftist philosophy. I am from West Bengal and I am in the education line. And although I have very firm faith in the indigenous ways of learning, but I'm very often accosted by questions like, in the present day scenario, when there is a globalization in every sphere, if we restrict or if we again go back to the Vedic school of thought and the Vedic ways of learning, will it be able to sustain our future generations all by itself? Is Vedic school of knowledge flexible enough to incorporate, or will it be able to stand by itself all alone? I mean, we have to be, it's global approach everywhere.
Right. So, first of all, I don't think the Vedic approach was restrictive, because otherwise not the students would not have flocked from all over the world to come and learn, get the Vedic knowledge, right, from different parts of the world. I mean, so it was not restrictive. That is just a bogey which has been created. But yes, it was merit based. So merit was very important. The pronunciation, the way you pronounced it, and all the we made, like, because in Sanskrit the sound is very important. The sound itself has a vibration. So if somebody is very interested in Vedas but is not able to pronounce it at all, so there used to be those kind of restrictions. So maybe today, if we go back to that system, maybe we can loosen those things. We can have a discussion on those things, whether we should loosen it, and we can let more people come in and study the Vedas. I mean, today as it is, there are the worldview has changed. So if we go back to the Vedic system, it won't be exactly maybe as perfectionist as it used to be in those times. We would make it more flexible today to maybe tolerate a bit more mediocrity. So that's the thing. I mean, we did not. It's up to us, right? If we are going to restructure our education system, we can take the best ideas from the past and see how well we can implement it today. So maybe we cannot have somebody who's able to memorize a whole text like that. That was probably a requirement in those days. That the way the examinations were conducted, that you could turn to any page and ask a student, "Come on, what is written in page number this or shloka number this? What does it say? And how does it have a bearing on this shloka?" So it was a different method of examination also. So you can't just completely just copy paste the Vedic education today, but you can take lots of ideas and see how it can strengthen today's problem solving approach, and which is being done by many. That's the approach I would advocate for. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Yeah, I think you're able to do that. We have a question from Santosh Kumarji. Santosh Kumarji, please ask your question now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am, for your time. I have one question which I ponder every time. See, reading, studying Vedic things and ancient things about India is one thing. The opportunity, it does not present me as good employment opportunity or economic opportunity as reading contemporary science or something else, other hobbies, right? So why would somebody like me, and essentially I'm needy and greedy like everybody else, so why would somebody like me read Vedic things? What opportunity it is offering? Why is it lucrative to read Vedic texts or Vedic or ancient languages or anything related to what we are talking about today? Why not something else which is giving a better opportunity?
Okay. So this is also a conversation, it's a very important question you have raised. This is a conversation that I want to really have about how we, we need to also make it related to employment. So when we think of Vedas, we think of just chanting, memorizing and all. We are not thinking of character building. Okay. So just to keep the employment issue aside for a little bit. But if you see some of the problems that India is facing today, like corruption, almost everybody wouldn't mind paying a little bit of bribe to get a job done, or when they get into political office they don't mind keeping some of the money for themselves. All this kind of moral degradation, if you see, a lot of problems in India today are because of that. And this is where a Vedic education actually addresses that building of character. Okay, where you would not do these kind of things which are adharmic also. Okay, at the same time, if you see, as a part of the Vedic education, if you also learn the Artha Shastra and all that, that makes you very pragmatic. It makes you very pragmatic. You'll not just go unprepared into the world, into fighting or war, or in the international relations. You'll be very strategic. So when you talk about Vedic education, don't just think of, oh, you're going to learn chanting this and chanting that. You're also building up your character and your personality. Okay, so now it is up to the government to connect all that and make it related to employment. So how, they have to make the case for Vedic enabled people, how they are able to perform better, how they're actually even able to become richer. Because mind you, not every Vedic studying Vedas doesn't mean you're becoming a sannyasi. You're still very much in the world. You can be in the world of grihastha. You can be a vaishya. You can be practicing. You can be earning a lot of money. You can be rich. I mean, you need not completely be like those. Only the teachers, of course, Brahmin teachers of those times, if you want to take any ideas from them about leading a frugal life, that's up to the individuals. But you can take ideas from them to enable you, to empower you, so that you do all those things that you mentioned. Who, I'm not saying that you should not read the contemporary books. The contemporary books on science are very much important. We regard them as our a part or something that has come from our legacy. The science and maths that we give to the world, based on which all this modern science has been produced, definitely we should not be excluding them from the curriculum. We should be reading them. We should totally be using them and in our building up our infrastructure. But I am saying revive the Vedas, the knowledge of the Vedas and the Upanishads and the various other, the commentaries and all that, so that you enable and empower yourself. So, I mean, why did Manjul Bhargava get the highest award in mathematics? By going back to some Vedic texts. So those are the things that I'm talking about, right? He actually went back and read all those Shulba Sutras. He read Brahmagupta, and he understood those slokas. And then it struck him how a certain, how the Gauss's theorem, how he could approach it differently. And he also combined it with the Rubik's Cube. So can you imagine? That is the kind of linkages that we need to make with the Vedic education. Some people are giving answers right there in the chat. More creativity, better recall, excellent. All these things come into play when you get a Vedic education. And I'm not saying go and do exactly the classical Vedic education. Take take from it. Of course, revive the classical Vedic education. Those who want to do it should be able to do it, because chanting the Vedas and those reverberations are important. But in the mainstream education, let there be Vedic enablement. Let us know what's in the Vedas at least as we pursue modern education.
Sahanaji, I just have a comment there. Like, one of the ways by learning our, our history. Sorry, you know what? Okay, I will have Mahindra ji. Can you please go ahead and ask your question? Thank you.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation and lecture. I just wanted to ask you that despite the aid of all the Upanishads, the Vedas, and so on, how were our ancestors not able to defend our territory, where our sisters, our wives, our elders were not protected by the Islamic invaders, and we lost an epic civilization? Do you have any thoughts on this matter at all, Professor?
Oh, sorry, what was the question?
The question is that despite all the knowledge that we have with the Vedas, the Upanishads, the whole epic civilization that we had, yet we were not able to protect our epic civilization from the Islamic invaders.
So there are two ways of looking at it. You can say, oh, we got destroyed, Nalanda got destroyed, so we were not able to protect ourselves. Or you can now say that we are still living today, practicing our Hinduism. We are still Hindus today, unlike the classical Persian, the civilization, the Greeks and the Persians. None of them are there today. Nobody, you don't find those pagans who were living in Persia and in Greece today, right? The whole of Persia has got Islamized. Greece is gone. Egyptian civilization is gone. They're all Muslims, but we are still surviving. So, I mean, please do not make the mistake of thinking that we were wiped out. Yes, I've made a case for destruction by the Islamic invaders, by the colonizers, but we have still survived. We have kept our religion intact. And though many of our texts were destroyed, the major texts are still there because we had an oral tradition, which again, a spark of it was still there. And that's how we are finding our way to revive ourselves. So don't forget the huge pushback that the Hindus put up. Okay, all those wars that the Hindus fought, like say the Marathas, right? We are told that the Mughal rule was spread all over India. That's not true. When the British came to take India, they didn't take it from the Mughals. They had to fight the Marathas for that. So the Marathas were Hindus, and they were totally protecting our civilization. So those are the kind of narratives that we still don't know, and we think that we got defeated, and so there was something wrong with our own civilization. That's not true. So there was a huge pushback. So if you look at our history, it has been years, a 1,000-year fight back, pushback by the Hindus to preserve, because that's how the Hindu Rajas, when northern India was destroyed by the Muslims, a lot of scholars fled to the south. The mathas and the agraharas that were set up in the south, many of them were by scholars who fled from the north. They were fleeing the persecution in the north. And then, of course, when the persecution got to the south also, then they tried to flee to other places. So that's how we somehow managed to survive and preserve something. Okay. So please do not see this as a failure. We could have done better, maybe if we were all united, and we can keep arguing about this until, until days and days pass. But let's remember that we are a heroic people, and we survived. We are still worshipping our gods. We don't know the gods that were worshipped in Arabia. When Arabia got totally Islamized, where are those gods that they were worshipping? They're all gone. We still have them. Okay. So please, a little bit of perspective is needed here.
Sahanaji, if I may, I was just going to make the comment there about, when we say that why do we need to learn Vedic, Vedic studies and all that. One of the thoughts which I agree with is, they're not my own thoughts, but one of the thoughts which I agree with is that the revival of the knowledge system and the history of our ancient techniques and our heritage in itself can be a game changer, because when you are a proud nation, a proud people, you are encouraged to go out and make contributions, because you know what, I have a great history. We come from a super fantastic group of people who had so much knowledge, and then why are we not there today? It's like a lot of people are not aware of it, and hence as you call self-loathing, right? if you have for 200 years, if you are put down, but now if you get a chance to know that, okay, we were something at one point of time, that could actually, help in all this, in the what do you call it, like the Indian exceptionalism, as you call it, as I'll call it.
Yes, I agree, totally agree. So this is, I see this knowledge of our own history as a way of motivating ourselves. So when we become proud people, we ourselves will not like to see the filth in on the streets, lack of hygiene, dirty roads, or projects not finished on time. We will get that. It will be like an energizer for us when we become proud. And we are not creating fake narratives to be proud about. We have genuine things. We have a lot to be proud of, and we use that as a way to motivate ourselves and to become world beating leaders, top leaders. That is what I'm looking for. That's the reason I'm in this. That's why I'm so passionate about writing history books and talking about it.
Sahana ji,
Yes.
thanks a lot for a great presentation. What I will put up here is how can we go forward? And that I would say is we should be, we have been asking very rigorous questions in this presentation to an Indic scholar. And we should be doing the same with other people, and especially those who are based on a scientific kind of knowledge. Because what happens there is we get bogged down by their qualifications or so-called peer reviews. I will give you a simple example. Most of you people or most of us must have appeared for personality test before taking up a job. Yeah? At the same time, everybody would question astrology, its efficacy. But nobody questions the results of the personality test, which are actually based on astrological parameters or parameters taken out of astrology and then applied to statistics and so on and so forth. So we are not questioning them, where are your basics, how it is scientific, what is the knowledge there. And we are doing the same thing with all Indic scholars. So I would say, let us go out and start questioning everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Totally and I will put it this way, that earlier on also, for example, Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta did not get along together. Brahmagupta was very skeptical about Aryabhatta's findings.
Yes.
But real debates didn't happen. So they both of them kept with their own notions. Whereas the culture of debating and Khandan Mandan was brought in by Shankaracharya, where two people go to the room, only one walks out.
No. You
that
cannot
is the
make generalizations that somebody brought this and that. It's too ancient. We still, the debate was not brought by one person. So that it was an ecosystem of debate was there, yes, but there were also very strong disagreements. Yes, I agree. But sometimes the students of one and the students would actually be debating with each other, because in the university system there was a debate. So when they used to get their degrees, they would have to talk about what they have learned, right, from the various philosophies or the various systems. So that would happen. So I understand your point. You're saying that there has to be more questioning, and we are not doing it the way that it should be done. I totally agree with you. That is something we should let us be well versed with our Nyaya also. What happens is that we often think that all this has been brought to us by modern science. So that's one of the reasons why we don't use our own ways of questioning, where we had all that pramana and all that, the rigorous questioning that we had, which is there, the texts are there. So we are not trained in that. We don't even know how to do that. So it will be very interesting if we learn all that, and then we are able to also read the Western, whatever has been written by, the scholars, the European scholars, and then be that, amalgamation, because that would really make us extremely good scholars.
Bhanuji, please go ahead.
Namaskar ji, thank you for this opportunity to attend the seminar. Namaskar Sahana ji. Very interesting inputs coming, and it's wonderful. I have read about your work. I have heard about your work from a lot of people in India and abroad. So you have done a great deal of research about the finer points of Sanskrit, which make anybody curious about knowing the rich knowledge that Sanskrit holds. Sanskrit is the repository of probably all ancient knowledge. So I have been talking to a lot of people who are teaching Sanskrit in their limited circles. May I request you to develop a body of knowledge which makes people curious about Sanskrit or about ancient texts? If you can start a teachers training institute about how to strategically bring curiosity, because in an ecosystem which is opposite to our Indic learning, in a leftist ecosystem, in a Macaulay ecosystem, we have and the system, our own government is not very much in accordance to what where we want to head. We need to find in the whole canvas some points where we can make people curious about why they should learn this language. So can you please make a body of knowledge, like a 3 months course for teachers, to make their students curious about Sanskrit? I hope my question makes sense.
Yes, yes, I understand. But and I know that there are people working in this area. The Sanskrit scholars, actual Sanskrit scholars, and even the Sanskrit Bharati itself. You see how wonderful it is in the way they are making people learn how to speak Sanskrit, and that itself is making them curious. So I see many movements there, but I know you are saying let's train the teachers. I agree that is something that not I alone, but a number of people together would need to do. But yes, this is something at the back of my mind. I hope things come together.
Mahendraji, please go ahead. Okay, looks like there's no more questions.
Okay.
All right. That was a very informative session. Thank you very much, Sahanaji.
Thank
And
you.
we are looking forward to your book. I've read your first book and it has made me more curious. So yeah, we'll look forward to the next book, and we'll publish this recording on our YouTube channel, Indic Studies Toronto. And thank you everyone for joining this session. Namaskar.
Namaste. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you.